Hello everyone! In this video, I'll be giving some tips that can help level up your art. Recently, I've been taking some classes on Coloso. They are the sponsors of today's video, and their motto is learn the best from the best. Their mission is to make professional education accessible to all learners by connecting them with industry professionals. So I'll be showing you some of the things I learned from the 2 Coloso classes I've been taking. So the first class I took is Fundamentals of Stylized Character Art by illustrator Mogoon. Mogoon has a very interesting teaching style. He goes very in-depth about each topic. He's also very scientific in the way he explains things. Like in chapter 12, he talks about what light is and how it is defined in physics. Mogoon does this because in art we are reproducing reality, and the best tool to reproduce reality is physics. Now this may sound confusing, but Mogoon does a really good job at breaking it down in simple terms that are also easy to understand. I found when he explains how light reflection works to be very interesting. First, there is specular reflection. Basically, specular reflection is a type of surface reflectance that is often a mirror-like reflection of light from the surface. In specular reflection, the incident light is reflected into a single outgoing direction. This would apply to things like mirrors or things that are metallic. These objects are really smooth, so they can bounce back the light into our eyes. Then we have diffuse reflection. This is the reflection of light from a surface such that an incident ray is reflected at many angles. This is the kind of light applied to most objects like rock, or anything that has a bumpy texture. Since it's bumpy and not smooth, the light goes in tons of different directions, which makes it look less shiny. In some cases we have both specular reflection and diffuse reflection. Mogoon's example was cast iron. One of my favorite parts of this class is where Mogoon talks about illustrating different textures in the bonus chapter, Texture Variety. It's the footage I've been showing you, and he goes over how to draw many textures. Another thing Mogoon talks about in this section is light bouncing off the ground and changing how the shading looks. So he starts with the shading looking like this, but let's say the ground is red. The light would bounce off the ground and cast some red onto the sphere. Bounce light is a great way to really make your coloring come to life. Of course, Mogoon doesn't only talk about coloring and rendering, he covers many topics, the first being commercial art and planning a drawing. In this chapter, my favorite thing he discussed is what makes a good drawing. Because as artists, we can think to ourselves, I want to make better art. But what does that mean exactly? And Mogoon describes it as art that fits its purpose, and this really resonated with me. He gave the example that the art style of Doraemon is very simple and that some people may not see it as good art. But its simple style is very readable and good for storytelling. It also doesn't take a super duper long time to draw the characters, and when creating a manga or comic this is important. So the art for Doraemon fits its purpose, which makes it good. I felt like Mogoon had some really interesting insights about this topic. Other topics he discusses are space and perspective, basic shapes through drawing objects and shapes, and my favorite, breaking down the human body into shapes with a stylized art style. I really liked this section because Mogoon not only goes over more realistic proportions, he also talks about how he stylizes proportions. One part I liked is when he's going over bones and muscles in the torso. He talks about how it's really good to understand how to stylize the shapes and how to convey them. An example he gave is for the shoulder blade, it's better to draw it as an angular shape if your character isn't very muscular. If you start to make it rounded in shape, the character starts to look like they have more muscle. I also like how he talks about how it's good to understand the structure and muscle of the body, but it's okay to simplify things and to understand the basic shapes. Like when he's breaking down the muscles of the arm, he tries to point out the shapes that he feels are the most important to keep in mind. And this makes things easier to follow and remember. And for the lower arm, he goes into a detailed breakdown. But in his art, he says he most often thinks of them as these simple shapes. Throughout the course, Mogoon also walks you step by step through the creation process of an illustration. Throughout it, he gives tips on all kinds of things and explains each thing he does in detail. Overall, I really like this class and I definitely learned some things from it. The next class I took is Realistic Character Art in a Traditional Painting Style by Erak Note. In this class, you will learn how to establish a realistic art style through well-defined faces and detailed coloring that resembles traditional paintings. Erak Note is a freelance concept artist that has been working in the gaming industry at companies like NCSoft for over 12 years. His art style is super pretty and I love the texture it has. I really like how in Chapter 3 he goes over what brushes he uses and what he uses them for. You are also able to download his Photoshop brush pack and use the brushes for yourself. Also, if you don't use Photoshop, Clip Studio Paint allows you to import Photoshop brushes. I use Clip Studio Paint, so I was really happy about this. All of the brushes are really nice and have a unique texture that you can use for a wide variety of things. I think they're really neat. Two chapters I found to be super interesting are chapters 6 and 7. In these chapters, Erak Note shows his coloring process that is known as glazing. He starts by creating a black and white painting and then adds color using layer blending modes. Like to add blue to the gray ball, he used the blending mode Overlay. He then adds some yellow light by setting his brush to soft light. Erak explains everything very clearly and at a nice pace, and in very great detail, which I really like. One part I loved is when he goes into detail about what each layer mode does, because honestly, I never really knew. I just kind of scroll through them until I find one I like. So it's really nice knowing what each one does. He also tells which ones he uses the most when painting. The ones he uses the most are Multiply, Screen, Soft Light, and Vivid Light. He uses Soft Light to add color, Vivid Light to lighten, Multiply to add shadows, and Screen is multi-purpose. He mostly uses it to add some color to very dark areas, but it can also make light colors lighter. In Chapter 21, he goes over local colors and the color picker. Basically, he's going over how to pick more realistic colors for your coloring, and you can do this by finding reference pictures. On your reference picture, drag the eyedropper tool across it and see how the colors change in saturation and value. Also, he recommends grabbing pictures that have pretty standard lighting, so just kind of a white light. Like for this case for the grapes, the colors start off light in value and low in saturation, but as the colors get darker, it also gets more saturated. I thought this was a very interesting way of observing colors, and I'll definitely do it to observe colors in my work. One of the tips he gave to make painting more comfortable is when you are choosing your base color, you should have it be the color of the broader surface. By making the circle be a color that is darker and higher in saturation, it's easier to paint because he only needs to paint a smaller area of the lightest color, compared to where if he starts with a lighter color, he has to add all of the darker color. Erak Note's class does majorly focus on coloring and rendering, but those aren't the only topics he discusses. In section 2, he goes over how to draw faces and body proportions. For drawing the face, he has a very systematic method for getting the features in the correct placement. He even provides a brush that automatically makes the guidelines he uses. These outer dots are a guide for where the endpoints of the face are. The second dot shows where the pupil should line up. If you draw a vertical line in between the center and the second dot, you get where the inner parts of the eyes, end of the nose, and mouth should line up. Erak Note continues further in detail as to how he lines up all of the features, and it's very interesting. And of course, he says you can style things to your preferences. This is a guide for how he styles his characters. In Chapter 10, I learned something that I found to be quite interesting. In this chapter, Erak Note is talking about light and shadow, and he talks about how people like me, often confuse shade and shadow. Shade means a darker area of an object where light can't reach. It is the other side of the object where lighting isn't in effect. Whereas shadow refers to the dark shape that appears on the surface when an object blocks sunlight or other light. He also talks about ambient occlusion. It is a term derived from 3D rendering techniques. He said no matter what object it is, as light occludes, the borders where the objects touch are bound to get darker. As the chapter goes on, he talks in detail about how to apply this kind of knowledge to your work. Throughout the class, Erak Note takes you through his creation process of an illustration from start to finish. He does this in a really thought out way and explains concepts very clearly. I really liked his teaching style, and he gives a lot of good information. Overall, both Mogoon's class and Erak Note's class are very informative and are a great way to learn from professionals. I really like how you are walked through their process in real time, and they both put a lot of thought into how to make things easily understandable to the viewer. If you are a beginner or you've been drawing for a while like me, I think anyone can learn from these classes. If you are interested in getting either of these classes for yourself, Coloso has provided a coupon code for you to use. All of the info and links are in the description. So that is all for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all on Saturday for my usual weekly video. Bye!